Thank you, David, for inviting me to come and share with you on the topic on financial wellness. So, I think one of the things that I thought is useful, which I'm going to share with you, is when I was told to share this topic, I thought in terms of actual health wellness. And when you look at financial wellness, and these three things looks kind of like very common sense, and I'll go through each and every one of them in detail. But when you think about financial wellness, it is a bit like your health. When you want to stay healthy, you do three things. One is you make sure that you eat well. Two, you make sure that you sleep well. And three, you make sure that you exercise. The important thing in all three is you don't do too much of everything. Everything needs to be in balance. And so when you look at financial wellness, it's also the same, whereby you think in terms of three things. One is think in terms of how do you manage your whole debt obligation. And a lot of times when we talk about investment, we talk about financial wellness, we're very focused on wanting to make money. We want to look for the quick buck that we can make, but we often forget that financial wellness is also about not borrowing too much, or if not, none at all. The second thing that is important in financial wellness is about protection. I know a lot of times when we think about insurance, we tend to think about, that's dreadful conversation to talk about insurance, but actually insurance is a lot more than talking about what will eventually happen to us, which we all know two things are sure in life. One is taxation and the other one is death. So I think protection is really not about the second thing that you know in certainty, and I'll touch a bit on that. And the third one is really about investment. What do you do when you stay on top of your investments? So I'll go straight into the first one, which is managing your debt obligation. I think when you look at debt in itself, debt is not necessarily a bad thing. However, how you want to use what you borrow and for what purpose then makes it a bad thing. So be very clear in terms of why you're borrowing. Are you borrowing for a need, or are you borrowing for pleasure, or are you borrowing for investment? And I think that in itself would be extremely important for us to remember and to go through. Because when you're borrowing for a need, such as trying to borrow for a house, I don't think any one of us, very, very few of us in this room will be born with the ability to say, I want to buy a house and I have enough cash to buy a house, and then immediately it is all paid up. Buying a house is a big financial obligation. And so when you're buying a house and you're borrowing for that purpose, that's borrowing for a need, that's a good thing. But if you say, I'm going to borrow because I'm going to make this big, wonderful trip that I'm going to make to see the Northern Lights in Iceland, then I think you may want to pause and ask yourself, why do I want to do that? Is that really a need, or is that for pleasure? And last but not least, if you're going to borrow money for investing, then that will essentially means that what if your investment goes wrong, horribly wrong, not only are you losing money, but you are now owing somebody the money that you borrowed, and that caused double stress for yourself. So it's important to know and be very clear when you want to borrow, what is it for? Secondly, ensure affordability when you're taking on debt. If you are going to borrow for a need, such as borrowing to buy a home, be it HDB or a condominium, it is important to look at affordability. We may all want to live in a certain place, a certain district, a certain size of apartment, but you got to look at your affordability. How much do you earn? How much money do you really have to spend every month? Be realistic about that. How much do you want to save? And then the difference would really be on the affordability factor. The balance that you have would really be what you can afford to then borrow against that amount, and ensure that you understand that. It is also about the timeline that you're borrowing. A lot of times we think that it is okay to borrow because I'm young, or I've got 30 more years, I can do 35 years borrowing, and therefore the amount that I borrow is going to be low. But that in itself is a problem, because you run into an issue of what happens if I don't have a job and I still have this housing loan that I've got to pay down to. So affordability is not only about how much you make and the difference between that and your expenses, but it's also about how long you want to borrow and make sure that you are confident around it. And that is something that my family and I had a conversation when I told them. I say, I'm actually going to come here and share with all of you on financial wellness. And I've got a son who's 22-year-old, and he asked me, so Dad, what does it mean, when you borrow for when you're buying a house and you borrow? I say, well, it's important to understand that you don't borrow to the extent that you're unable to pay back, because jobs in itself does change, and what you're going to do is different, and so it is important to recognize that in itself. The next is on paying down debt, starting with the highest cost ones. Sometimes we make the mistake of borrowing from credit card companies. We make the mistake of borrowing for pleasure, and that doesn't mean that there is no more hope. It means that whenever you have enough money, don't spend that much, the balance of it, go pay down the most expensive debt that you have. And that is really, really important, because a lot of times when we pay down debt, we don't look at the interest rate that is associated with that particular debt that you have. It is important to make sure that you look at which is the most expensive debt and really aggressively pay that down, and ensure that it's no longer an obligation for you. And then you go down to becoming debt-free, and that is a wonderful position to be in, because it's never good to have a debt overhanging on you, even though you're borrowing it for the right reason, which is like buying a house. So that's on managing your debt properly. The second one is about protecting yourself and your family. Now here, when you talk about protection, we talk about protecting for the unexpected. The most basic thing that you can do for protecting yourself against the unexpected is to make sure that you save enough in your savings account or put it into time deposit, whereby we call it a rainy day fund for 3 to 6 months of your expenses. So this is in event that you suffer the unfortunate experience of not being able to continue in a job or being laid off. You have 3 to 6 months worth of money that you have saved up that allows you to protect yourself against the unexpected. The other area that you could do to protect yourself against the unexpected is really to look at protecting yourself against, let's say, this total disability that you may encounter because of some accident. So if you took up policies that allows to protect you from loss of income because of total disability, in some instances, there are insurance that protect you from loss of income due to loss of jobs. That allows you to protect yourself against the unexpected, and that's a good thing. The second thing is to provide for loss of income. So same thing. Here it is about making sure that you are able to save, you're able to get those right type of insurance policy. And together with the unexpected, sometimes it's about hospitalization, and ensure that you have the right type of hospitalization plan. MediSave, MediShield Life is good. And if some of you want to top up against that, that in itself is also then useful for you. But then again, I go back to the question of affordability, and don't spend something that you can't afford just because you want to stay in a higher grade class in the hospital. And the last one is about planning for your family. So here there are just 2 points that I want to cover for planning for your family. One is to make sure that clearly you plan for something that all of us don't like to happen, but it will happen to us one day. And so you want to make sure that your family is provided for if bad things happens to you. You want to make sure that you also plan for your family for retirement, that you will not burden your children, and that you have put aside retirement funds for you to be able to use it, and that is really planning ahead to ensure that it doesn't burden the next generation for your own retirement. The last one is for some of us who have the good fortune of being able to plan for legacy, something that you want to pass on to your family, then that's about legacy planning. And again, this is something that is useful when you think about your overall financial wellness. The next one is about staying on top of your investment. You would have heard so much this afternoon from the earlier speakers, David, Ho Kwon Peng, and as well as Chong Ti earlier, that talks about understand your reasons for investing. A lot of times when we get into investments, people do not realize why they want to go into an investment. And it is important for us to pause and ask, why do I want to invest? Is it because I want to invest due to the fact that I'm planning for education, to save for education for my children? Or sometimes for younger people, I want to invest because I want to save for the trip that I'm going to make. And a lot of times you want to invest because you want to protect and grow your wealth so that that nest egg can grow and allow you to use it. The second thing is to define your own time horizon and your risk appetite. So here, investment is about your ability to stomach the up and downs in the markets and in the underlying instruments that you have. And the up and down itself is defined sometimes by the horizon that you're willing to take. If you're willing to take a longer-term horizon, then some of the short-term gyration that you see is something that you can afford. And that goes with also your risk appetite. How much money are you willing to lose when you look at investment? A lot of times when you look at investment, the number one question that we always ask, and we are so anxious to ask that question, is how much money can I make out of this investment? But a lot of times we forget to ask ourselves the question, how much money will I actually lose when I get into this investment? And risk appetite is defined by the amount of money that you are willing to lose when you go into an investment. And that is a very important point to remember and something that you should be guided by. No different from what Mr. Ho mentioned earlier, where he talked about his father, talking about, what is the amount of money that you're willing to lose. And risk appetite is really defined by how much money you're willing to lose. If you're investing for retirement and you're saying this amount of money, I'm actually not willing to see a lot of gyration, I'm not willing to lose a lot of money behind that, then that guides you on the instruments you're going to invest in, where you have to ask the question, how much money will I lose, so that you can match your own expectation. So that's really, really important. Some of us may be able to set aside a very small amount of money that says, I don't mind losing the amount of money that I have here. I set aside $10,000. I don't mind losing half of it. And that then guides your risk appetite for that amount of money that you set aside. And so it is important to define your time horizon and as well as your risk appetite. Last but not least, this is something that was covered quite extensively by David. Conduct regular portfolio reviews. When you invest in equities, you look at the companies, you understand what's happening in the underlying company. If you invest in unit trust, you have to do the same. You have to understand who is the fund manager, has that changed? Because a lot of times, the investment returns is directly correlated to who is managing that fund. If the fund manager changes, then you got to ask the question, is it institutionalized in the way they manage their fund, or is it based on a star fund manager? Because the moment the star leaves, then it becomes really dark, right? And so I think that's really, really important for you to think about it. And the last part of it is we encourage everybody to invest on a diversified basis. So meaning you have equities, you may have some fixed income, bonds, and you may have unit trust that is in equities, that is in fixed income, or even multi-asset. And when you look at those instruments collectively, you have to conduct your review to understand, is it still right for you to hold this percentage of equities or bonds and this amount in exposure to this industry or to these countries? So review is not only about understanding the underlying, but it's also about diversification. It's about understanding the concentration by industry, by countries, and by instruments. So that's really, really important. And these are the three things that I wanted to just share on what it means to stay on top of your investment. So these are the three broad, simple steps to financial wellness. One is to manage your debt obligation. Pay down your debt as quickly as you can. Stay debt-free if you can. Second, ask yourself, have you sufficiently protected yourself and your family such that if anything that is unexpected that happens, it doesn't create a financial burden for you and your family? And last but not least, stay on top of your investment by understanding your time horizon, understanding your risk appetite, and more importantly, conducting regular portfolio reviews to know how your underlying instruments are performing and make the necessary changes whenever you need to. So this is all that I have, and I'm glad that I'm beating time that told me to stop in 5 minutes. And so I would give back some time to the panel so that you can ask the questions. Thank you.